The First Encounter. An Alien's Tale. The amber glow of the tavern's bioluminescent fixtures cast long shadows across Commander Zekthai's weathered carapace as he lifted his third drink of the evening. Around him, younger soldiers from a dozen different species chatted loudly about their recent victories, their voices filled with the confidence that only comes from never facing true terror. The old Krillian veteran's 4 eyes remained fixed on the swirling liquid in his glass, memories dancing like phantoms in its depths. "Tell us about the humans, Commander," came a voice from the crowd. Zekthai's mandibles clicked involuntarily at the mention of that species. The tavern fell silent, as it always did when someone brought up the war that had ended 3 cycles ago. Even the youngest recruits had heard whispers of what the humans were capable of, though few believed the stories. Zekthai set down his glass and turned his massive head toward the speaker, a young Velteran whose blue scales still gleamed with the polish of inexperience. The commander's voice, when it came, carried the weight of 1,000 battles and the chill of deep space. "You want to know about humans?" Zekthai's translator buzzed softly as his native clicks and chirps became universal standard. "Very well. But understand this first. Everything you think you know about warfare, about survival, about the limits of what a sentient being can endure, the humans will teach you is wrong." The young Velteran leaned forward eagerly, his crest fluttering with anticipation. Zekthai almost pitied him. "I was a ship captain then, commanding the heavy cruiser Vexnara as part of the Galactic Federation's 3rd Fleet. We had just received word that a previously unknown species from a backwater system called Sol had begun expanding beyond their home planet. Intelligence suggested they were primitive, having only recently developed faster-than-light travel. Their ships were crude, their technology decades behind our own. Command decided they needed to be contained before they became a problem." Zekthai's claws drummed against the table's surface, each tap echoing like distant gunfire. "We were so confident. The Federation had never encountered a species we couldn't either diplomatically integrate or militarily subdue within months. These humans would be no different, or so we thought." The tavern had grown completely silent now. Even the ambient hum of the environmental systems seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The first engagement took place near their outer colonies, around a gas giant they called Jupiter. My fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers, 36 destroyers, and over 200 smaller vessels. We outnumbered the human fleet 3-1, outgunned them by an even wider margin. Their ships looked like metal scrap held together with determination and desperation. We expected them to surrender immediately when faced with our overwhelming superiority. The Krillian's eyes dimmed as he continued. The humans sent a single transmission before the battle began. No surrender offer, no negotiation attempt, no plea for mercy. Just 5 words in their barbaric tongue: "You picked the wrong species." A nervous chittering came from somewhere in the crowd. Zekthai ignored it. "When we opened fire, they did something no civilized race had ever done before. Instead of maintaining formation and engaging in proper fleet combat, they scattered like insects, each ship operating independently. But this wasn't panic. It was strategy. They knew they couldn't match our firepower, so they refused to fight by our rules." The commander paused to take another drink, his 4 hands trembling slightly as the memories flooded back. Their ships were fast, impossibly fast. They had stripped away everything non-essential. Life support was minimal, armor was paper-thin, crew quarters were practically non-existent. Every cubic meter was dedicated to engines and weapons. They turned their vessels into guided missiles with crews inside. "Surely your superior firepower allowed you to destroy them easily," interrupted a young Haxlorian engineer, his tentacles writhing with skepticism. Zekthai's mandibles spread in what might have been a smile if it wasn't so terrifying. "You would think so, wouldn't you? But humans don't fight like us. We aim for clean kills, precise strikes that disable enemy vessels while minimizing casualties. It's civilized warfare. Humans, he shuddered. Humans fight to win, no matter the cost. The old veteran's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They targeted our bridge modules, our command centers, our communication arrays. Not to capture or disable, but to create chaos. Within the first 10 minutes of combat, half our fleet commanders were dead or cut off from their forces. The humans had studied us, learned our command structures, our protocols, our weaknesses. But what about their losses? Pressed another voice from the crowd. Massive, Zekthai admitted. In that first engagement, they lost 60% of their fleet. By any reasonable military standard, it should have been a crushing defeat for them. But humans don't measure victory the same way we do. For every ship they lost, they eliminated one of ours. More importantly, they learned. The tavern's atmospheric recyclers hummed quietly as the alien veteran gathered his thoughts. The battle lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of the most brutal, chaotic fighting I had ever witnessed. No formation flying, no elegant maneuvers, no honor duels between capital ships. Just pure, relentless violence. Their smaller ships would ram our destroyers, detonating their reactors on impact. Their pilots would set collision courses and refuse to deviate even when we targeted their bridges directly. Zekthai's carapace clicked as he shifted in his seat. I watched a human frigate, its hull breached in a dozen places and leaking atmosphere, pursue one of our heavy cruisers for 20 minutes. The human ship was dying, its crew was dying, but they never stopped firing. When their main guns failed, they used point defense systems. When those failed, they rammed. Surely such reckless tactics couldn't be effective against trained soldiers, scoffed the Haxlorian engineer. Effective? Zekthai laughed, a sound like grinding metal. By the end of that first battle, my fleet had been reduced to 7 operational vessels. The humans withdrew with what remained of theirs, maybe 40 ships total. We claimed victory because we held the field, but we knew the truth. We had been hurt, badly hurt, by what we considered primitives. The commander's voice took on a distant quality as he stared into his empty glass. But the real horror wasn't in the battle itself. It was in the aftermath, when we tried to understand what we had faced. Our analysts studied the wreckage, examined the human vessels we had managed to disable instead of destroy. What they found changed everything we thought we knew about warfare. He gestured to the bartender for another drink before continuing. Every human ship had been modified beyond manufacturer specifications. Not just upgraded, completely rebuilt from the inside out. They had removed safety systems, eliminated redundancies, stripped away everything that wasn't directly related to combat effectiveness. Their life support systems were so minimal that a hull breach anywhere would kill the crew within minutes. They had chosen to sacrifice safety for performance. That's insane, whispered the young Velteran who had started the conversation. No, Zekthai corrected him. That's human. They had calculated that in a war against a superior force, their only advantage was their willingness to accept casualties that no other species would tolerate. Every human crew member knew they were probably going to die, and they flew into battle anyway. The tavern remained silent as the implications sank in. Most species valued individual life above military objectives. The idea of deliberately designing ships that prioritized mission success over crew survival was alien to their way of thinking. We spent the next 3 months regrouping, analyzing human tactics, developing countermeasures. Command assured us that the first engagement had been an anomaly, that no species could maintain such casualty rates indefinitely. They were wrong, of course. The humans weren't just willing to die for their cause, they were actively planning for it. Zekthai's new drink arrived, and he took a long sip before continuing. The second engagement took place near their colony world of Kepler 442b. This time, we brought twice as many ships, implemented new communication protocols, and developed specific anti-human tactics. We were confident that we had adapted to their unconventional methods. The old warrior's eyes grew distant again. The humans had adapted too. Their ships were different this time, even faster, even more heavily armed. But more importantly, their tactics had evolved. They no longer scattered randomly at the start of combat. Instead, they moved like a school of predatory fish, flowing around our formations, striking from unexpected angles, disappearing before we could respond effectively. "How many ships did you lose in the second battle?" asked someone from the back of the crowd. "More than the first," Zekthai admitted quietly. "But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened to the Krentalor, our flagship. The humans didn't just destroy it, they captured it. Boarded it with troops that fought like nothing we had ever seen before." The commander's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme distress among his species. "Galactic Federation forces are trained for ship-to-ship combat, boarding actions, even ground warfare. But we fight with honor, with rules, with respect for enemy wounded and prisoners. Human ground forces." He trailed off, unable to continue for several moments. "Human ground forces fight like their ships fly, to win at any cost. They don't take prisoners unless it serves a strategic purpose. They don't respect surrender unless it benefits them tactically. And they never, ever give up." I watched security footage from the Krentalor's final moments. The human boarding teams continued fighting even after being mortally wounded. One human soldier, with 3 limbs severed and massive internal bleeding, crawled across a corridor to plant an explosive charge that killed himself and 6 Federation Marines. The young Veltaran's crest was now flat against his skull, a sign of fear among his kind. "But surely your superior numbers and equipment gave you an advantage in close combat?" Zekthai's laugh was bitter. "You still don't understand. Humans don't rely on equipment superiority. They rely on themselves. Every human soldier carries enough firepower to level a building, but more importantly, they carry something we had never encountered before: absolute determination to complete their mission regardless of personal cost." The veteran paused to compose himself before delivering the final detail of his tale. "The boarding of the Krentalor took 4 hours. 4 hours of corridor-by-corridor fighting against an enemy that refused to acknowledge when they were beaten. When it was over, every single human soldier was dead. But so was every Federation crew member aboard the ship. The humans had captured our most advanced vessel not to steal our technology, but to deny it to us. The last human alive on that ship set off the reactor overload that destroyed everything." The tavern remained completely silent for long minutes after Zekthai finished speaking. Finally, the young Haxlorian engineer asked the question that was on everyone's mind. If they were so effective, why did the war end? How did the Federation achieve victory? Zekthai's 4 eyes focused on the questioner with an intensity that made the young alien step backward. "Who told you the Federation won that war?" The implications of that simple question rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. The young engineer stammered, "But the official reports, the victory celebrations—" "The war ended," Zekthai said carefully, "because both sides agreed it was in everyone's best interest to stop fighting. The Federation had learned that humans were unlike any species we had previously encountered. And the humans—" He paused, choosing his words with obvious care. "The humans had learned that we could be reasoned with once we understood their capabilities." The old warrior finished his drink and stood slowly, his joints creaking with age and old injuries. "You asked me to tell you about humans. Here is what you need to understand. They are not stronger than us, not smarter than us, not more technologically advanced than us, but they possess something that no other species in this galaxy has. The absolute, unwavering conviction that there is no price too high to pay for the survival of their kind." As Zekthai moved toward the tavern's exit, his voice carried back to the silent crowd. The humans are our allies now, trading partners and fellow members of the Galactic Council. They build hospitals and schools and art galleries just like the rest of us, but never ever forget what they are capable of when threatened. Because I promise you this, they haven't forgotten how to fight. They've just chosen not to. The tavern door slid shut behind the old veteran, leaving the younger soldiers to contemplate his words in the amber glow of the bioluminescent fixtures. Each one quietly thankful that humanity had chosen friendship over conquest. The Ground War. Memories of Terror. The medical bay of the transport ship, Velnara, hummed quietly as Dr. Kixandra finished her examination of the elderly Thexian patient. Lieutenant Colonel Mordak had been her most challenging case since joining the Galactic Medical Corps, not because of his physical injuries, but because of the psychological scars that ran deeper than any scanner could detect. His scaled hide bore the marks of old wounds, but his eyes held something far worse, the haunted look of someone who had witnessed the impossible. "Your physical therapy is progressing well, Colonel," Dr. Kixandra said, her tentacles adjusting the bioscanner's settings one final time. "But I'm still concerned about your sleep patterns. The nightmares are getting worse, aren't they?" Mordak's crest, once a brilliant crimson that marked him as an elite Thexian warrior, had faded to a dull brown over the years. He flexed his clawed hands experimentally, testing the rebuilt joints where human weapons had once shattered bone and sinew. "They're not nightmares, Doctor. They're memories." The Aquarian physician had heard this conversation before, but something in the colonel's voice today was different, more urgent, as if he needed to share his burden before it consumed him entirely. She settled into her chair and activated the privacy field around the medical bay. "Would you like to talk about Kepler 438c?" she asked gently. Mordak's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Kepler 438c. The Federation called it a strategic mining world, rich in rare minerals, perfect for supporting a major industrial complex. Command told us it would be an easy assignment. Establish a garrison, protect the mining operations, maintain order among the civilian population. A routine, peacekeeping mission." The old soldier's eyes focused on something far beyond the medical bay's bulkheads. 3 divisions of the finest Federation troops in the galaxy. Thexian shock troops, Grellian heavy infantry, Vexni airborne rangers, 50,000 soldiers total, with full orbital support and the most advanced equipment our armories could provide. We were professionals, Doctor. Veterans of a dozen campaigns against rebellious colonies and pirate fleets. Dr. Kixandra had read the reports, of course. Every medical officer who dealt with war trauma had studied the Kepler 438c incident. But the official files told only a fraction of the story, focusing on casualty numbers and strategic outcomes while ignoring the human cost, not just to Federation forces, but to the psyche of an entire generation of soldiers. "The humans had claimed the world 6 months before our arrival," Mordak continued, his voice taking on the mechanical tone of someone reciting facts to avoid confronting emotions. "A small colony, maybe 15,000 settlers total. Mixed civilians and military, according to our intelligence. They were mining the same rare earth elements we needed, but their methods were primitive, inefficient. Command decided that incorporating them into our operation would be more cost-effective than establishing a competing facility." The colonel's claws clicked against the medical table's surface, leaving small scratches in the metal. "We sent a standard diplomatic message first, of course. Offered them Federation citizenship, fair compensation for their existing investments, integration into our mining operation as junior partners. Very reasonable terms, considering they were technically trespassing on a world the Federation had already surveyed and claimed." "And their response?" Dr. Kixandra prompted, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 5 words, Mordak said quietly. "The same 5 words they always used. You picked the wrong species." The Aquarian physician had heard those words before, in other debriefing sessions with other traumatized veterans. They had become something of a legend among Federation forces, a phrase that never failed to chill even the bravest soldiers. Not because the words themselves were threatening, but because of what always followed them. General Tech Mole was in command of the operation, the colonel continued. Brilliant tactician, veteran of the Andromedean campaign. He interpreted their response as bravado, the kind of defiant posturing that primitive species often displayed when faced with superior force. The plan was simple. Establish orbital superiority, land our forces in 3 waves, secure the mining facilities, and accept their surrender. Standard procedure for dealing with recalcitrant colonies. Mordak's crest flickered between brown and pale yellow, a sign of extreme distress among Thexians. The orbital phase went exactly as planned. Their defensive satellites were decades behind our technology, easily neutralized by our destroyer squadrons. Their ground-based anti-aircraft systems were similarly primitive. Within 6 hours, we had complete control of the space around Kepler 438c and could land our troops wherever we chose. "But something went wrong," Dr. Kixandra observed. "Everything went wrong," the colonel corrected her, "but not in the way we expected. Our first indication that this wasn't a routine pacification came when we tried to establish landing zones. The humans didn't contest our orbital superiority. They abandoned it. Every single defensive position above ground was evacuated before our first troop transport entered the atmosphere." The old warrior's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We should have recognized the warning signs. When an enemy refuses to fight where you expect them to, it usually means they're planning to fight where you don't. But we were confident in our technological superiority, our numerical advantage, our professional training. We were so certain of victory that we ignored the most basic rule of warfare: never underestimate an enemy's capacity for adaptation." Dr. Kixandra made a note in her medical file, but her attention remained focused on the colonel's words. She had treated dozens of veterans from the human conflicts, and their stories all shared certain elements. An initial confidence that turned to confusion, then to fear, and finally to a deep, abiding respect for human capabilities that bordered on terror. "The first wave landed without opposition," Mordak continued. 12,000 troops, perfectly coordinated insertion onto 3 different continents. We established perimeter defenses, secured landing zones for follow-up forces, and began advancing toward the human settlements. Everything proceeded according to plan for exactly 73 minutes. The colonel paused to accept a glass of water from Dr. Kixandra, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted it to his lips. The attacks began simultaneously across all 3 landing zones, but calling them attacks doesn't really capture what happened. Attacks suggest an enemy force moving against you, something you can see coming and prepare for. What the humans did was different. How so? They had turned the entire planet into a weapon, Mordak said simply. Not just fortified positions or defensive emplacements, but the landscape itself. Roads that looked perfectly normal would collapse under the weight of our vehicles, dropping entire convoys into prepared kill zones. Buildings that appeared abandoned would explode when our troops approached, not from planted charges, but from structural modifications that turned them into massive fragmentation bombs. The Aquarian physician had difficulty imagining the level of preparation such tactics would require. How long would it take to modify an entire planet like that? Months, maybe years, the colonel admitted. The humans had been planning for this confrontation long before we arrived. They had studied our tactics, our equipment, our standard operating procedures. Every trap, every ambush, every defensive position was designed specifically to counter Federation forces. Mordak set down his water glass and stared at it for several moments before continuing. But the environmental modifications were just the beginning. The real horror was the human soldiers themselves. We had expected to face a militia force, civilian settlers with basic military training. What we encountered instead were professional soldiers who fought like nothing in our tactical manuals. Surely your superior equipment gave you an advantage, Dr. Kixandra suggested. The colonel's laugh was devoid of humor. Our equipment was superior, yes. Our personal armor could stop anything in the human arsenal. Our weapons could penetrate any protection they had. Our sensors could detect them from kilometers away. But humans don't fight fair, Doctor. They don't engage in honest combat between equals. The old soldier's voice took on a tone of grudging admiration. They used our strengths against us. Our armor was proof against their bullets. So they used explosives that could knock us unconscious through kinetic shock. Our sensors could track them perfectly, so they used that information to lead us into traps. Our weapons were devastatingly effective at long range, so they made sure every engagement took place at point-blank distance. Point-blank distance? Closer than you think is possible, Mordak said. Humans are smaller than most Federation species, more agile, capable of moving through spaces we couldn't fit into. They turned that disadvantage into an advantage by refusing to fight us where our size and strength mattered. Instead, they attacked from underneath, from above, from inside the walls of buildings we thought were empty. Dr. Kixandra made another note, this one about the colonel's increasing agitation. His crest was now cycling rapidly between colors, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. But she didn't interrupt. These sessions were as much about letting him process his trauma as they were about her understanding it. The second wave landed on schedule, the colonel continued, his voice becoming more distant as he retreated into memory. Another 15,000 troops, fresh and ready for combat. Command thought that doubling our numbers would allow us to overwhelm the human defenses through sheer force. They were wrong. The humans had been watching our insertion patterns, learning our procedures. When the second wave's transports entered the atmosphere, they found the landing zones had been modified. The humans had somehow managed to establish anti-aircraft positions that hadn't existed 6 hours earlier. Not permanent installations that our orbital sensors would have detected, but mobile systems that could be deployed and withdrawn before we could target them. The colonel's claws were now leaving deep gouges in the medical table's surface. We lost 17 transports before we realized what was happening. 17 ships, each carrying 200 of the finest soldiers in the Federation, destroyed by weapons that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. How were they able to move heavy weapons so quickly? The doctor asked. They weren't using heavy weapons, Mordak explained. That was the terrible genius of their tactics. Everything they used could be carried by a small team and deployed in minutes. Shoulder-fired missiles, portable laser designators, man-portable railguns. Each weapon was barely powerful enough to threaten one of our transports, but they used dozens simultaneously, creating a crossfire that no pilot could evade. The old warrior fell silent for several minutes, lost in memories that still had the power to terrify him. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. The third wave never made it to the surface. Command finally realized that conventional landing operations weren't going to work against an enemy that could reshape the battlefield faster than we could adapt to it. Instead, they ordered a full orbital bombardment of all human positions. Dr. Kixandra knew what came next from the reports, but hearing it from someone who had been there made the horror more immediate. How did the humans respond to the orbital bombardment? They disappeared, Mordak said simply. 15,000 humans gone without a trace. Our sensors showed massive underground tunnel systems, but they were too deep for our orbital weapons to penetrate. We thought we had won, that the bombardment had driven them so far underground that they were effectively neutralized. But they weren't neutralized. No, the colonel confirmed. They were regrouping. While we were establishing permanent bases on the surface, consolidating our positions, setting up communication networks and supply lines, The humans were moving through their tunnel systems, preparing for the next phase of their campaign. The Aquarian physician could see that the colonel was approaching the most traumatic part of his story. His vital signs were elevated, and his crest had settled into a steady pale yellow, the color of absolute terror among Thexians. The night attacks began 2 weeks after the orbital bombardment, Mordak whispered. Humans emerging from hidden tunnels, striking at our patrols and supply convoys, then vanishing back underground before we could respond. But these weren't random raids. They were surgical strikes designed to isolate our forces and cut our supply lines. Each attack was perfectly coordinated, timed to maximum effect. They would hit a communications relay just as a supply convoy was passing through the area, ensuring that the convoy couldn't call for help when they attacked it 10 minutes later. They would sabotage our vehicle's navigation systems, then ambush the crews when they stopped to make repairs. The colonel's breathing was becoming increasingly labored as he relived the horror of those weeks. But the worst part wasn't the attacks themselves. It was the psychological warfare. The humans left messages for us, written in Federation standard, describing exactly how they were going to kill us. Not threats or propaganda, but detailed tactical analyses of our weaknesses and step-by-step descriptions of how they planned to exploit them. And were their predictions accurate? Dr. Kixandra asked, though she dreaded the answer. Terrifyingly accurate, Mordak confirmed. They would tell us that Squad 7 would be ambushed at Checkpoint Delta at exactly 0347 hours using thermal charges placed in the drainage culvert beneath the road. Then Squad 7 would be ambushed at Checkpoint Delta at exactly 0347 hours using thermal charges placed in the drainage culvert beneath the road. The old soldier's crest was now flickering between yellow and white, indicating that he was approaching complete psychological breakdown. But he seemed determined to finish his story, to purge himself of memories that had haunted him for decades. "We tried everything," he continued desperately. "Changed our patrol routes, altered our schedules, reinforced our convoys, established new communication protocols. Nothing worked. The humans always seemed to know exactly what we were going to do before we did it ourselves. They had infiltrated our command structure somehow, or they were so good at predicting our behavior that it amounted to the same thing." After 6 weeks of constant harassment, General Thekmol ordered a complete withdrawal to our original landing zones. We would establish defensive perimeters around our bases and wait for reinforcements from the fleet. It was a sound tactical decision, the only one that made sense given the circumstances. Dr. Kixandra waited for the colonel to continue, but he seemed to have reached some internal barrier. She gently prompted him. "What happened during the withdrawal?" "The humans let us go," Mordak said, his voice filled with confusion even after all these years. 50,000 Federation troops, the most powerful military force in the galaxy, retreating from 15,000 human colonists, and they just let us go. No attacks, no harassment, no final devastating blow. They watched us withdraw and did nothing. That seems unlike human behavior. That's what we thought too. The colonel agreed. Command was convinced it was a trap, that the humans were allowing us to concentrate our forces so they could hit us with some kind of devastating final attack. We spent weeks preparing for a siege, fortifying our positions, establishing overlapping fields of fire. The old warrior's crest finally settled into a steady white, the color of absolute despair. The attack never came. Instead, 3 months later, we received a message from the human leadership. They were willing to negotiate a settlement to the conflict, they said. They had prepared a treaty proposal that they believed would be acceptable to both sides. "A treaty proposal," Dr. Kixandra repeated. "After defeating the Federation forces so decisively?" "The terms were simple," Mordak explained. "The humans would retain control of Kepler 438c, but they were willing to sell the Federation mining rights to specific areas of the planet in exchange for technology transfers and guaranteed trade agreements. Essentially, they were offering us exactly what we had demanded at the beginning of the conflict, but with the roles reversed. The implications of this reversal were staggering. In the space of 6 months, a primitive human colony had not only defeated a vastly superior Federation force, but had somehow maneuvered them into accepting a position of inferiority. But the most chilling part of the proposal wasn't the economic terms, the colonel continued. It was the military addendum. The humans included detailed tactical analyses of every engagement we had fought, pointing out exactly where our strategies had failed and how they could have killed us all if they had chosen to do so. Dr. Kixandra felt a chill run down her spine. They could have killed you all? Every single one of us, Mordak confirmed. The document included architectural plans for our base defenses, patrol schedules we thought were classified, communication codes that should have been unbreakable. They knew everything about our operations down to what individual soldiers had for breakfast. They could have wiped us out at any time, but they chose not to. Why? Because, the old soldier said quietly, they didn't want to rule over a galaxy of corpses. The humans had demonstrated their capability to defeat any Federation force sent against them, but what they really wanted was to be left alone to pursue their own interests. The war was never about conquest for them. It was about establishing their right to exist without interference. The colonel fell silent again, and Dr. Kixandra realized that she had just heard something that wasn't in any official report. The Federation's withdrawal from Kepler 438c had been presented as a strategic redeployment, a decision to focus resources on more important objectives. But the truth was far more disturbing. Command accepted the human proposal, Mordak said finally, not because it was a good deal for the Federation, but because we finally understood what we were facing. The humans weren't just another species to be conquered or assimilated. They were something entirely new, something that forced us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about warfare, about negotiation, about the nature of intelligent life itself. The old warrior stood slowly, his joints creaking with age and old injuries. I've spent 30 years trying to understand what happened on Kepler 438c, Doctor. 30 years of nightmares and analysis and desperate attempts to make sense of an enemy that fought by rules we had never encountered before. And have you reached any conclusions? Mordak looked directly at her for the first time during their session, his eyes holding a mixture of fear and respect that she had never seen before. The humans won that war not because they were stronger or smarter or better equipped than us. They won because they understood something about conflict that we had never grasped, that the side willing to pay the highest price is usually the side that gets to dictate terms. And they were willing to pay any price? Any price at all, the colonel confirmed. Including their own lives, their own civilization, their own future. That's what made them so terrifying, Doctor. They fought as if they had nothing to lose, because from their perspective, they truly didn't. Either they would be free to live as they chose, or they would die trying. There was no middle ground, no compromise, no acceptable defeat. As Mordak moved toward the medical bay's exit, he paused one final time. The humans are our allies now, trading partners and fellow members of the Galactic Council. But never make the mistake of thinking they've changed their fundamental nature. They've just found ways to achieve their goals without resorting to warfare. Yet, the final lesson. Why wars? And the council chambers of New Geneva Station floated serenely against the backdrop of distant stars, its crystalline structure catching and refracting the light of 3 different suns. Admiral Vex Kara of the Galactic Federation Navy stood at the massive viewing port, her 6 arms clasped behind her back in a gesture of contemplation that had become habit over her long career. Today marked the 15th anniversary of the Terran Accords, the treaty that had ended the most devastating conflict in galactic history and ushered in an era of unprecedented cooperation between species. Behind her, The mixed delegation of Federation diplomats and human representatives worked quietly at their terminals, finalizing the details of the newest trade agreements and technology sharing programs. The scene was peaceful, civilized, exactly what interstellar relations should be. But Admiral Vexkara remembered when these same chambers had been filled with the desperate voices of military commanders pleading for reinforcements that would never come. "Admiral?" The voice belonged to Ambassador Chen Wei, one of the human delegation's senior negotiators. His species' peculiar custom of aging gracefully had left him with silver hair and lined features that somehow managed to convey both wisdom and barely contained laughter. "The preliminary agreements are ready for your review." Vexkara turned from the viewing port, her compound eyes adjusting automatically to focus on the human diplomat. Even after 15 years of working together, she still found humans fascinating to observe. They moved with an economy of motion that spoke of constant physical awareness, as if every gesture was calculated for maximum efficiency. It was a trait shared by all predator species, but humans took it to an extreme that made even veteran soldiers uncomfortable. "Thank you, Ambassador," she replied, accepting the datapad with 2 of her hands while the other 4 continued their unconscious defensive positioning. "I trust the mineral rights negotiations proceeded smoothly?" Chen's smile was gentle, but Vexkara had learned to recognize the steel beneath his diplomatic courtesy. "As smoothly as can be expected when dealing with the hegemony's tendency toward bureaucratic obstruction. We've reached a compromise that should satisfy all parties involved." The Admiral scanned the preliminary documents, noting the careful language that protected human interests while appearing to offer substantial concessions to their trading partners. It was masterful diplomacy, the kind of subtle maneuvering that had made humanity invaluable partners in galactic affairs. But Vexkara remembered when that same tactical brilliance had been turned against Federation forces with devastating effect. "Ambassador," she said carefully, "might I speak with you privately? There's a matter I've been meaning to discuss." Chen's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. To most observers, it would have looked like nothing more than a diplomat preparing for a delicate conversation. But Vexkara had been studying human body language for decades, and she recognized the subtle signs of a predator assessing potential threat levels. "Of course, Admiral. Shall we use the secure conference room?" They walked through the station's corridors in comfortable silence, past the carefully designed spaces where dozens of different species worked together on projects that would have been unimaginable before the Terran Accords. A group of young Krillian engineers collaborated with human technicians on improvements to faster-than-light communication systems. Aquarian medical researchers shared data with human biochemists working on treatments for genetic diseases that affected multiple species. It was a testament to what could be achieved when different civilizations chose cooperation over conquest. But Admiral Vexkara remembered when these same corridors had echoed with the emergency klaxons of a station under siege, when the Federation's finest military minds had gathered in desperate attempts to find some way to counter human tactics that seemed to violate every principle of civilized warfare. The secure conference room was small and austere, designed for conversations that required absolute privacy. As the door sealed and the privacy fields activated, Vexkara found herself alone with one of the most dangerous individuals in the known galaxy. Not dangerous in the crude sense of physical threat, but dangerous in the way that intelligent predators were always dangerous, unpredictable, adaptable, and utterly committed to the survival of their species. "You want to know how it really ended," Chen said quietly, settling into his chair with the fluid grace that marked all human movement. "The war, I mean. The official histories are incomplete." Admiral Vexkara's mandibles clicked in surprise. After 15 years of careful diplomatic interaction, she had never expected the human to raise the subject directly. I was hoping you might be willing to share your perspective on certain events that remain unclear in our records. Chen's laugh was soft, but there was something in it that made the Admiral's carapace prickle with instinctive alarm. Our perspective. Yes, I imagine there are quite a few gaps in the official Federation account of how the war ended. Your leaders were very careful about how they presented certain information to the public. The Federation's priority was maintaining stability during a difficult transition period, Vexkara said carefully. The full details of military operations were classified to protect ongoing negotiations. Of course, Chen agreed. Much easier to tell everyone that the conflict ended through mutual recognition of shared interests rather than explaining what actually happened during the final phase. Much easier to maintain the fiction that both sides simply decided warfare was counterproductive. The Admiral leaned forward, her 6 arms creating an unconscious defensive barrier. You're suggesting that the official account is inaccurate? I'm suggesting, Chen said gently, that the truth would have been rather more disturbing to galactic civilization as a whole. People sleep better at night believing that conflicts between advanced species can be resolved through rational negotiation. They're less comfortable with the idea that sometimes wars end because one side demonstrates a capacity for destruction that makes further fighting unthinkable. Vexkara felt a chill run through her exoskeleton. She had suspected for years that the Terran Accords had been negotiated under circumstances that were never made public, but hearing it confirmed by a human diplomat was both terrifying and strangely liberating. What really happened during the last 6 months of the war? Chen was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing his words carefully. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone sharing secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. You have to understand the position humanity found itself in by the 4th year of the conflict. We had successfully defended our home system and our major colony worlds, but we were facing an enemy with virtually unlimited resources and a willingness to accept casualties that would have broken any sane civilization. Every engagement was a victory for us tactically, but strategically, we were being worn down by attrition. The Admiral nodded. This matched the Federation's own assessment from that period. Human forces had proven devastatingly effective in small-scale engagements, but they lacked the industrial base and population to sustain a long-term conflict against an opponent with thousands of member worlds. Our analysts calculated that we had perhaps 2 years before Federation reinforcements would overwhelm our defensive capabilities through sheer numbers, Chen continued. We could continue winning battles, but we would inevitably lose the war unless something fundamental changed about the strategic situation. So you developed new weapons, Vexkara guessed. Some kind of technological breakthrough that shifted the balance of power. Chen's smile was sad and somehow proud at the same time. No, Admiral. We developed a new strategy. Something that would make the Federation's numerical superiority irrelevant by changing the nature of the conflict itself. The Admiral waited for him to continue, but Chen seemed to be struggling with how much to reveal. Finally, he appeared to reach a decision. Operation Prometheus was approved by the Terran High Command 8 months before the Accords were signed. The name was chosen deliberately. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Our operation was designed to steal something far more valuable from the Federation. What could be more valuable than weapons technology? Vexkara asked. Information, Chen said simply. Specifically, complete tactical and strategic intelligence on every Federation military installation, every troop movement, every classified project, every communication between High Command and field units. We didn't just want to defeat Federation forces in battle. We wanted to know everything about how your entire military operated. The implications of this statement were staggering. Complete intelligence penetration of Federation forces would have made human tactical superiority absolute, turning every engagement into a massacre. But more importantly, it would have given humanity the ability to strike at the heart of Federation power rather than simply defending their own territory. How? Was all Vexkara managed to ask. The same way we had been winning every battle since the war began, Chen explained. We used your strengths against you. The Federation's greatest advantage was your integrated communication systems, the quantum entanglement networks that allowed instantaneous coordination between forces separated by hundreds of light years. Your commanders could direct operations across multiple star systems in real time, something that gave you an enormous tactical advantage. The Admiral was beginning to understand where this was leading, and the realization filled her with retrospective horror. You found a way to penetrate our communication networks. Not penetrate, Chen corrected. Infiltrate. There's a difference. Penetration implies breaking into a system from the outside, which would have been detected eventually. Infiltration means becoming part of the system itself, indistinguishable from legitimate users until you choose to reveal yourself. The human diplomat paused to pour himself a glass of water from the conference room's refreshment station, his movements casual and unhurried despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. The initial infiltration took place during the second year of the war, during the Battle of Rigel Station. Human forces captured several Federation communication nodes intact, along with the encryption protocols and authentication codes necessary to access the quantum entanglement network. But those codes are changed regularly, Vexkara protested. Even if you had gained initial access, you should have been locked out within days. We would have been, Chen agreed, if we had remained as outside observers. But we didn't. Instead, we used our initial access to insert monitoring programs into the Federation's own code update systems. Every time your security protocols generated new encryption keys, our programs ensured that copies were sent to predetermined locations where human intelligence could retrieve them. The Admiral felt her exoskeleton flush with embarrassment and terror as she realized the full extent of what Chen was describing. You were inside our command networks for the entire war. For the last 2 years of the war, Chen confirmed. By the time Operation Prometheus was fully implemented, we had real-time access to every Federation military communication, from strategic planning sessions in the High Command to tactical reports from individual squad leaders. We knew about every troop movement, every supply shipment, every operational plan before the orders were transmitted to field commanders. The silence in the conference room stretched for several minutes, as Admiral Vexkara absorbed the implications of this revelation. The Federation's entire military strategy during the final phase of the war had been based on the assumption that human forces were operating with limited intelligence, making tactical decisions based on incomplete information. The reality was that humanity had possessed better intelligence about Federation operations than many Federation commanders themselves. Why didn't you use this advantage to launch a decisive offensive? She asked finally. With that level of intelligence superiority, you could have destroyed our entire fleet structure within months. Chen's expression grew solemn. Because we weren't trying to destroy the Federation, Admiral. We were trying to end a war that was consuming the resources and lives of both our civilizations. A complete military victory would have required us to occupy and garrison thousands of worlds, to suppress rebellions and manage hostile populations for generations. That wasn't the future humanity wanted. So instead, you chose to demonstrate your capabilities in a way that would force negotiations, Vexkara realized. We chose to show the Federation exactly how vulnerable their entire civilization had become, Chen corrected. The final phase of Operation Prometheus involved simultaneously accessing the computer systems of every major Federation world, not to cause damage or steal information, but simply to prove that we could do so whenever we chose. The Admiral remembered the chaos of those final weeks before the Accords were signed. Critical infrastructure systems across dozens of worlds had experienced mysterious malfunctions that lasted just long enough to be noticed, then corrected themselves with no apparent cause. Military communication networks had briefly displayed messages that shouldn't have been possible to insert. Secure databases had been accessed and their contents copied, but nothing had been stolen or altered. The message was clear, Chen continued. Humanity had developed the capability to cripple Federation civilization without firing a shot. We could have shut down power grids, transportation networks, communication systems, and military command structures across half the galaxy simultaneously. The war could have ended with billions of Federation citizens stranded without food, water, or medical care while their governments collapsed into chaos. But you didn't, Vexkara said quietly. But we didn't, Chen agreed, because that would have made us exactly the kind of species that we had been fighting against. Instead, we chose to offer the Federation a choice: negotiate a peaceful end to the conflict, or face the consequences of continuing a war against an opponent who could destroy their entire civilization without losing a single human life. The Admiral understood now why the true circumstances of the war's end had never been made public. The Federation's citizens had been told that their leaders had chosen peace through wisdom and mutual respect. The reality was that they had chosen peace because the alternative was the complete collapse of galactic civilization. The Terran Accords weren't just a peace treaty, she said slowly. They were essentially terms of surrender disguised as mutual cooperation. Chen's smile was gentle but implacable. They were an opportunity for both our species to build something better than what had come before. Humanity gained the right to exist without interference, and the Federation gained a partner that could help them develop technologies and strategies they had never imagined. Everyone benefited from the arrangement. And if the Federation had refused to negotiate? The human diplomat was quiet for a long moment before answering. Then this conversation would be taking place in a very different galaxy, Admiral, one where the Federation as we know it no longer existed, and humanity was struggling to rebuild a civilization from the ashes of a war that should never have been fought. Admiral Vexkara stood and walked back to the viewing port, staring out at the peaceful scene of ships from dozens of different species moving through their trade routes and diplomatic missions. Everything they had built together over the past 15 years, the technological advances, the cultural exchanges, the economic prosperity, existed because humanity had chosen mercy over total victory. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked without turning around. "Because there are whispers in the Federation Senate about renegotiating certain aspects of the Accords," Chen said quietly. "Some of your leaders seem to believe that 15 years of peaceful cooperation have somehow erased the reasons why those agreements were necessary in the first place." The Admiral turned back to face the human diplomat, understanding the true purpose of their conversation. "You're reminding us that those capabilities still exist." "I'm reminding you that humanity's fundamental nature hasn't changed," Chen replied. "We remain a species that will pay any price to ensure our survival and freedom. The fact that we prefer cooperation to conflict doesn't mean we've forgotten how to fight when fighting becomes necessary. And if someone were to propose military action against human interests?" Chen's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Admiral Vexkara's carapace prickle with instinctive alarm. "Then they would discover that Operation Prometheus was never shut down, Admiral. It was simply set to dormant status, waiting for activation if the need ever arose." The implications of this revelation were almost too enormous to comprehend. For 15 years, humanity had maintained the capability to cripple galactic civilization while pretending to be nothing more than enthusiastic trading partners and cultural ambassadors. Every Federation world, every military installation, every communication network remained vulnerable to human infiltration. "How many people know about this?" Vexkara asked. In the human government? Perhaps a dozen individuals, all of them bound by security oaths that would make disclosure a capital offense. In the Federation? Until today, only the members of the High Command who negotiated the original accords. Chen paused. And now you. Admiral Vexkara understood the responsibility that had just been placed on her shoulders. She was now one of the guardians of a secret that could either preserve galactic peace or shatter it completely, depending on how wisely it was handled. What do you want from me, Ambassador? Simply to remember this conversation if anyone ever suggests that humanity has become soft or complacent during our years of peace, Chen said. We've become comfortable, certainly. We've grown to appreciate the benefits of cooperation and mutual respect. But we haven't forgotten the lessons that brought us to this point, and we haven't dismantled the capabilities that made those lessons possible. The human diplomat stood and moved toward the door, pausing as the privacy fields deactivated. The Federation has been an excellent partner, Admiral. Our species have accomplished remarkable things together, and I hope we'll continue to do so for generations to come. But that cooperation exists because humanity chose to offer it, not because we were forced to accept it. As Chen left the conference room, Admiral Vexkara remained standing by the viewing port, watching the peaceful traffic of interstellar commerce flow past the station. Every ship out there, every world in the Federation, every life in their sprawling civilization existed at the sufferance of a species that had chosen mercy over conquest. The truly terrifying thing wasn't that humanity possessed such devastating capabilities. It was that they had used those capabilities to create peace rather than to impose dominion. A species capable of destroying galactic civilization had instead chosen to become its protectors, asking only to be left alone to pursue their own development. But Admiral Vexkara now understood that this protection came with an unspoken condition. As long as humanity's fundamental interests were respected, they would continue to be the galaxy's most valuable partners. Should those interests ever be threatened, however, they would become something far more dangerous than any military force the Federation could possibly imagine. Looking out at the stars, she offered a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening that the Federation's leaders would have the wisdom to remember this lesson, because the consequences of forgetting it would be beyond anyone's ability to survive. The Terran Accords had ended a war by demonstrating that some enemies were too dangerous to defeat and too valuable to destroy. For 15 years, humanity had proven that they could be the galaxy's greatest allies. Admiral Vexkara prayed that no one would ever force them to prove what kind of enemies they could become.